Hello everyone, good afternoon. It's so great to see so many of you here at this extremely important and exciting event. I'm Ellie Robinson, the chair of this event, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to Able Child Africa's launch of their new Disability Inclusive Child Safeguarding Guidelines. Throughout my life as a disabled person in the UK, I've always been greatly protected. The importance of these guidelines that we're launching this afternoon is that soon, across the globe, all children will feel safe and cared for like I do. We're all here because we want to better safeguard children with disabilities, and these guidelines are going to give us all, as individuals and organisations, the information and tools we need to do just that. But first, I'm going to hand you over to Lauren Waters, Head of Programmes from Able Child Africa and lead author on these guidelines, who'll give us a bit more of an intro on how the guidelines were developed and what their intentions are, before introducing our first speakers of the event. So, hello Lauren.
Thank you, Ellie, and thank you so much everyone for being here at the launch today. We are so excited to have had nearly 450 people register for this event, which I think in itself demonstrates that there is a need for more information on disability inclusive child safeguarding, but also there is a real appetite to learn more about how to safeguard children with disabilities across the sector. The guidelines are a result of an exciting partnership between Save the Children International and Able Child Africa, and I would like to thank the wider Save the Children team, and in particular thank Martina Ulsander, the Global Lead for Children with Disabilities, who made some invaluable contributions to the work. The guidelines also reflect the input of more than 57 individuals at 21 organisations, including practitioners from safeguarding, child protection, disability and development sectors. And we'd also like to thank all of those who took the time to share evidence, provide feedback and offered encouragement during the process. We have been lucky enough to have the UNICEF Sudan youth advocate, Ines Youssef, write the foreword for the guidelines, in which she makes a strong and passionate argument for disability inclusive child safeguarding. We are now going to hear that introduction to the guidelines from Ines herself.
Hi everyone. My name is Ines Youssef and I became UNICEF Sudan Youth Advocate in 2020. Children with disabilities have a right to be safeguarded, be heard, and included in decisions that affect them. Even today, children with disabilities are experiencing disturbing levels of inequality and less protection than other children experience in development and humanitarian work. Many children with disabilities do not think or believe that they have the same rights as children without disabilities. Children with disabilities are among the most vulnerable and disadvantaged in their communities. For example, children like me who are deaf face many issues communicating with or understanding those who do not use or understand sign language. Therefore, in many situations, our preferences, feelings, and opinions are not taken into consideration simply because we have a disability, which makes us less safe. Safeguarding children with disabilities is fundamentally about realizing the rights of children with disabilities. When we say all children have the right to feel protected, this can only be true if children with disabilities are included. Always remember that each decision you make, the projects you support, and ideas that you have are likely to touch us. I encourage everyone that works in the development and humanitarian sectors to use these guidelines to ensure children with disabilities are empowered, protected, and safeguarded so that they can fulfill their rights and reach their full potential.
Thanks, Ines. You've raised some really powerful and important points there. I now want to talk a little bit about the intention of these guidelines and give you a little bit of detail about how they were developed. Our hope for the guidelines is that they become an industry-wide go-to on disability inclusive child safeguarding for development and humanitarian workers alike. However, we recognise that we are only at the beginning of fully understanding how to safeguard children with disabilities, and we hope that these guidelines will act as a catalyst for further work and deeper deliberation in this area. Although the guidelines focus on children with disabilities, they are not intended to provide specialist advice only to be used by disability inclusion experts. They are for everyone. The guidelines are for senior management, practitioners on the ground, communication staff, and specialists in disability inclusion or safeguarding. They are relevant for donors, child rights organisations, and organisations representing or working for persons with disabilities. These guidelines apply to the work that we all do. We know that disability is not always visible. In all projects involving children, it is likely that there will be at least one child with disabilities, if not more. Therefore, it's not a question of if we need to safeguard children with disabilities, it's a question of how we need to safeguard them, and the responsibility is on all of us. The approaches outlined in the guidelines are primarily about treating children as individuals and recognising their unique experiences and therefore their unique safeguarding requirements. We believe that every child is different, and taking this individualised and disability inclusive approach to safeguarding will actually better protect all children. If there is one message I would like to leave you all with, it would be that these guidelines are not about donor compliance or about managing organisational or reputational risk. They are fundamentally about the rights of children with disabilities and ensuring that our actions do not violate these rights. In practice, this means that the rights of children with disabilities are given precedence throughout the safeguarding process, and crucially, their concerns, preferences, and self-autonomy drive our considerations of what constitutes best practice for disability-inclusive child safeguarding. It also means that the guidelines need to reflect the voice and experience of children with disabilities, as opposed to being based on assumptions made by other people. Therefore, Able Child Africa and Save the Children International, Save the Children Rwanda and Uwezo Youth Empowerment started this process of developing the guidelines by conducting a series of participatory workshops with 15 children with disabilities and 21 youth with disabilities. We're now going to hear from Bahati Omar, the Executive Director of Uwezo Youth Empowerment, an organisation of people with disabilities in Rwanda, and Marcel Sebrimana, the Head of Sector Strategies and Child Rights Governance for Save the Children Rwanda. Both Uwezo and Save the Children Rwanda were instrumental in designing and leading the initial consultations with children and youth with disabilities, which informed much of the content of these guidelines. They are now going to talk to us about how the consultations were done and why they believe the guidelines are so important. So just as a first question then, can you briefly describe the process of the consultations and why you felt they were an important aspect of the process?
Yes, so this was a team effort between Uwezo Youth Empowerment, Save the Children, and Able Child Africa from the development of the concept paper. So we made sure that all our inputs are put in. So we together worked on the questionnaire, and then we customized the questionnaire in the Rwandan context. A big role that was played between Uwezo and Save the Children, since we are locally based here. And also the next step was now bringing on board children with disabilities and youth to go through the questionnaire and give their own insights. Yeah, so there's nothing we can do for children with disabilities if we don't involve them. And this is the slogan, nothing about us without us. And with this, we are able to bring children and youth with disabilities in a workshop to share their experience, their personal experience, taking them through different scenarios where they can speak up, share insights, but also challenge what they have experienced before. A number of methodologies have been used that are child-friendly, disability inclusive, and you try to accommodate to every need that children needed to be able to actively involve. And with this, so that was put together, and we were able to generate the guidelines that we have today. What we learned is that no matter how much we can think of children with disabilities, but they also have their reality that they're facing today that can only be shared once they're given a chance. So yeah, that's what I can say. My colleague, you also have something to add?
Sure. Thank you so much, Bahati. As you just mentioned, the process, of course, initially involved Able Child Africa, Save the Children, and Uwezo Youth Empowerment. And we all built from our previous experience working with children and making sure that children are safeguarded, that they are not put at any harm by our actions and also interventions in the field. So the first step was thinking about how we have been making sure that all children are safe. and think about it again in the perspective of children with disabilities. And as Bahati already mentioned, we had to come up with some tools, but we had to also involve children in making sure that the tools really collect information that is most relevant for them, making sure that we hear and listen and understand how our different interventions have been affecting children and youth with disabilities, and also telling us how we could make improvements if we really want children with disabilities to participate fully without any disturbance, without any harm into our activities. So it was really important for children and youth with disabilities to share how they feel and how they feel in different activities that we involve them into, or other organizations involve them into, and also how they have been experiencing such activities with the aim of really understand areas of improvement. And from the scenarios that they shared, from the responses and also feedback on how we could improve the situation and make sure that they are safeguarded, this is where their inputs were very critical in designing and also drafting these guidelines.
Thanks both, that's really useful. So what do you think the biggest risks that organisations pose to children with disabilities in their work are?
Yeah, so building from our work that we have been doing, but also looking at different interventions of different organizations, we know that working with children, especially looking at the programs that advance their well-being, their rights, at some points it can put them at risk of being harmed, and also put at risk of being abused, sexually abused, emotionally abused, or even to some extent exploited by our own interventions and also own staff or activities. So we believe that working with children with disabilities, again, put us on even a further pressure of not really understanding how we have to work with them, because we know that children with disabilities, not everyone understand how to work with them. We know we have been working, for example, with children with disabilities, and our staff don't have capacity to communicate with them or to use sign language. And in such areas, it's not always that our programs or activities we are involving such children into will be necessarily safe for them. And at some points, if these activities are not even safe for them, we are not able to really understand how they feel, or we can harm them in a way that we really don't want, or unintentionally, but then we cannot know the issues and address them even before they take another bigger risk or impact.
Yeah, just to add, so it is popular, and it's a fact that children with disabilities are not actively involved in the development of different programs that are meant for them. And this is a very big risk because the issues they would face, and the most important, most especially when there is a risk mitigation, children with disabilities are not accounted in. And also my colleague mentioned about communication. Yeah, so it's very difficult to communicate with children with disabilities today in most settings because of the prejudice and stigma, but also a barrier to communication and the communication channels that are not accessible to a wide range of children with different impairments. And also the fact that there's still little knowledge on how to handle issues of children with disabilities, but also communicating with them and protecting them. It may expose them to a number of safeguarding issues, and it may not even be taken serious because the child in the end wouldn't be able to claim or to complain or even follow up with any feedback that would be helpful for that child in that situation.
Great, some really interesting points raised there. Following on from this, how will organisations such as yourself use the guidelines?
Sure. Thank you so much for the good question. One of the starting point is making sure that the guidelines are known internally and also externally to our key stakeholders, especially partners, our contractors, our different stakeholders that you are working with to implement our programs. So this is going to be a very big work to make sure that they understand them and are aware about them. But secondly, it's going to be really important for children and youth with disabilities we are working with themselves to be aware of the guidelines and understand how we're going to be supporting them. And in terms of any issue that they have with us, they can feel free to reach out to us and make sure that we are serving them in a more safer way. We are also going to be reviewing our existing mechanisms to make sure that they are complying with the guidelines, making sure that children with disabilities and their issues are well captured. This could be also involve reviewing the way we receive feedback and complaints from children with disabilities, but also making sure that our response to issues that we receive are tailored and contextualized to the issues and challenges that children with disabilities face. So I believe they are going to be influencing a number of changes again at the organizational and programmatic level.
Yeah, so a lot have been mentioned by my colleague Marcel. Yeah, so we'd almost do the same, but just to add that WESO being a lead in the country on safeguarding of children with disabilities, we'll use this opportunity to also make safeguarding known among the disability organizations. Because the current experience is that there's a lot mentioned about child protection and protection of the rights of persons with disabilities, but safeguarding has not been on the rise. And this is the right time. And as well as being part of the development of the guidelines, we stand in good position to raise awareness in the community, but also most importantly, educate our youth advocates that we have across the country who interact day to day with children with disabilities. And like my colleague mentioned, we will be there for everyone, every organization seeking for guidance and consultation on how they can make their current safeguarding practices more disability inclusive of children with disabilities.
Fab. So just as a final thought from you both, if there was one message you would like to send to other organisations working with children with disabilities, what would it be?
Well, to me, the one message I could give to other organizations like us could be children with disabilities count. So in whatever we do, we should count on them, give them a platform to demonstrate what they're going through, to remove systemic and physical barriers that would limit their involved engagement, and also putting their mechanisms that would protect them from any harm that could be caused by our interventions. That's the only message I can give them. Thank you.
Sure, thank you so much. For me, the message I would give is that we cannot achieve our goals, our organizational goals, without considering every girl, every boy, and also considering children with disabilities. So a boy and a girl with disabilities should be considered and also should be treated equally and given opportunities to exercise fully their rights. So protecting them and making sure that we have safe protective environment is really critical. And as organizations working for children and children with disabilities, we have to make sure that we exercise our mandate carefully.
Great. Well, they were fantastic and really useful insights and reflections from you both. And a massive thank you to you and your organisations for all your work helping to develop the Disability Inclusive Child Safeguarding Guidelines.
Thank you too.
Yeah, we thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much to Bahati and Marcel for that invaluable insight. Now I'm going to introduce 3 youth with disabilities advocates from Kenya and Rwanda who have been involved in the development of the guidelines. Firstly, we welcome Devin and Charles, who are both part of a youth-led advocacy project focused on the realisation of the Sustainable Development Goals for children with disabilities in Rwanda. They took part in 2 consultations facilitated by Able Child Africa, Uwezo Youth Empowerment and Save the Children Rwanda, with their opinions and views helping to kickstart the development of the guidelines. We also have Maria, a global diversity and inclusion expert from Kenya. Maria is the founder of the Njeri Maria Foundation, which primarily aims to advance the lives of children and adults with cerebral palsy. She has written a blog alongside the launch of the guidelines and will be facilitating the conversation with Devin and Charles today.
Welcome. My name is Maria Njeri. From Nairobi, Kenya. I am here with brilliant youth with disabilities from Rwanda, and we will be answering some questions. Devin, say hi, and Charles, say hi.
Hi, my name is Devin.
Hi. Hi, my name is Charles.
Thank you. My first question would be, why do you think it is important that organizations consider how best they can safeguard children with disabilities in their work?
Thank you. I think children with disability live with barriers. They in their daily life, they always have barriers like attitude, like negative attitude, depends on their disability, and also building which are not inclusive, whereby they fail to live or to make their steps like others. So with those barriers, of course, they are not included in some stuffs or in some activities because of those barriers. Yeah, that's why.
Thank you. Charles?
Okay, thank you. My name is Charles. I think it is very important for organizations to safeguard children with disabilities because, first of all, in those organizations it is where you can find the people who have those knowledge and skills to know how to safeguarding and child protection issues, because they train their workers, they train their mentors and volunteers known as leaders. So it is very important for organizations, and also they have a good cooperations with the different institutions, either public and other private institutions, and also they try to look for families where there are some problems. So because they are particular concerning about children with disabilities, it is very important for organizations, and they are in a good position to be the best to safeguard children with the disabilities.
Thank you for that. And I know that you were involved in some workshops that you attended on disability inclusive safeguarding. Why were these workshops so important for you?
For me, I attended a workshop of safeguarding and where I studied about difference between safeguarding and child protection, and I've seen that safeguarding is the way you prevent the harm,
Yeah.
and also child protection is the way uh, you the way you handle that situation when it's already happened. Yeah, and it helped me a lot to know about safeguarding. Thanks.
Charles, you
Yes.
attended the workshops too?
Yes, I attended more. I remember safeguarding and child and protection, communication skills, SDGs development with the rights of persons with disabilities. But really what I got from them, I didn't know first the what is child protection, really. I knew that everyone deserves rights, but I didn't know what particular about children, especially with disabilities. So for communication, I got more, and I now really appreciate that.
Yeah, and the good thing about involving youth with disabilities or children with disabilities is that they're experts of experience. So every when organizations engage with them more, then there's better sharing of perspectives and ideas on how to make sure all children are safe and protected. Okay, and for my final question, it is, what is your key message that you give organizations who are working with children with disabilities on how to adopt disability inclusive safeguarding? Charles?
Yeah.
So,
Yes, thank you. Yes, my message to those organizations who would wish to adopt inclusiveness, disability inclusion and safeguarding, the first thing is to have a good, clear line of policies they will use just to make children with disability inclusive either at school and families. And another advice is to for those organizations to try to relate to the public policies that are in the country, but leave behind children and youth with disabilities. So those organizations, they would try to involve those policies, and they try to relate to persons with disabilities in the Leave No One Behind program, because they are good to remember those people are being left behind.
thank you.
Yeah, for me, I think I can tell them to make sure that all staff receive training about safeguarding, on how they are going to make sure that safeguarding is done to those children with disability. And also, I think they have to talk with children with disabilities about their safeguarding, the safeguarding practice, to understand the best safeguarding with disability. so that to make it better. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for that. And I think generalizing all of it is both of you are saying organizations need to do better to ensure they develop safeguarding practices and to ensure all children with disabilities are involved in the process, and they must adopt the safeguarding policy. Okay, so thank you for your fantastic contributions.
You too,
Thank
Maria.
you.
Thank you so much, guys. It's great that the voices of youth with disabilities are being listened to when we're talking about safeguarding. So now, to accompany the Disability Inclusive Child Safeguarding Guidelines, Able Child Africa have worked with animators Rumpus to create a child-friendly, accessible video. The aim of this video is to inform children with disabilities about their right to feel safe and to encourage them to speak up and demand action if they ever do feel unsafe as a result of our work. Before screening the video, we're going to hear from Steph from Rumpus, who will tell us a little bit about the creative process. And then following the video, Lauren will be back with a presentation on the guidelines. So please do enjoy.
Hello, my name's Steph Boskill. I'm creative producer at Rumpus Animation. We're a 2D animation studio based in Bristol, and we're really pleased to work with Able Child Africa on this piece. The purpose of the animation is to empower children with disabilities, to help them understand their safeguarding rights, and to also offer just a bit of gentle advice on what to do if something doesn't feel right. The animation needed to be really friendly, really colourful and really easy to understand, and we wanted to use a child character to convey the empowering feelings that come about from sharing information with a trusted adult. So the first phase of the project was the storyboard, which we based upon the script, and in this phase we worked out how the little girl's feelings could be translated onto the screen, and we found that using bold pebble shapes were a really effective way of reflecting African patterns, but also how the little girl was feeling. They playfully kind of bob on screen, and in the first scene she kind of pops one, and then when the scenario begins to change, they morph into slightly darker colours, begin to encroach on her space and make her feel uncomfortable. And then when we return to the girl at the end of the animation, again the bubbles and pebbles come back. When after she shared the information with the adult, they're once again floating again. In the scene that kind of visually describes a trauma that the girl has been through, we wanted to keep the reference explicit enough for the children to make the link, but not too triggering. So we designed a kind of growing silhouette mechanism just to help show how an adult you thought you might trust could also show you harm. We hope you enjoy it, and we hope it goes on to be a really useful disability inclusive child safeguarding tool where it's needed most. Thank you very much.
My disability doesn't define me. I know I can achieve big things in my life, and feeling unsafe because of my disability shouldn't hold me back. But I do sometimes feel less safe than others. There have been times that someone said or did something that made me feel unsafe, uncomfortable, sad, and lonely. I didn't know how to tell anyone, and I didn't think anyone would believe me because of my disability. One day, someone might make you feel the same way. It could be someone you trusted or who has been helping your family. It can be difficult to know what they are doing is wrong, but you can feel it. It just doesn't feel right. It is not okay if someone is doing something that makes you feel unsafe, uncomfortable, sad, or lonely. Having a disability does not mean we have to accept it, and adults should protect us from this harm, always. You might think your disability means no one will listen, but you have a right to be listened to and for something to be done about it. Tell someone you trust in whatever way works for you. I have a disability and I have the same right to feel as protected, listened to, safe and happy as everyone else. And you do too.
I hope you all enjoyed that video, and thank you, Steph, for sharing some of the thinking behind its production. I now want to provide a little bit of detail about what the guidelines actually contain and how you can use them. The guidelines can be broadly divided into two sections. The first section, chapters 1 to 4, set the scene and make the case or explain the relevance for disability inclusive child safeguarding. Chapters 5 to 9 move beyond justification and provide practical solutions for ensuring the work carried out by organisations is safe for children with disabilities. The last 4 chapters of the guidelines relate to 4 key stages of the child safeguarding cycle: empowerment, prevention, reporting and response. They provide explanations on the barriers children with disabilities face during each of these stages. And most importantly, they offer practical recommendations of approaches or adaptations that will include children with disabilities in each of these stages and ultimately better protect them. The guidelines recognise that the first most important step in ensuring child safeguarding is disability inclusive is for organisations to commit to and hold themselves accountable to safeguarding all children, including children with disabilities. Many organisations may feel they do not have the capacity or resource to safeguard children with disabilities effectively, but disability inclusive child safeguarding does not need to be expensive, and there are some strategies that exist that are relatively low cost and we think doable for smaller organisations with less resource. In Chapter 5, the guidelines pull out these commonly perceived barriers to implementing disability inclusive child safeguarding that may exist within organisations and offer reasonable solutions for training staff, sharing out responsibilities, or budget planning that are inexpensive. Chapter 5 also offers examples of how organisations should apply the principles of universal design, accessibility, and reasonable accommodation when planning for budget and resource allocation to support disability inclusive child safeguarding. But most importantly, it talks about what organisations need to do at a minimum, as well as the ideal commitments organisations can make, recognising that not all organisations will have the means or the resources to do absolutely everything. One thing that all organisations need to do with all staff, volunteers, partners or consultants is to increase awareness on the specific and unique risks children with disabilities face. Disability complicates and compounds safeguarding risks. The discrimination, disregard, and often the disdain children with disabilities experience can directly lead to serious incidences of abuse, and all organisations need to pay attention to this reality and take it seriously. In Chapter 6, we look at common categories of abuse, and based on the feedback we got from children with disabilities themselves, the guidelines unpack the distinct and complex threats to safety children with disabilities experience in all of our work. This is particularly relevant for sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, and the figures speak for themselves. Children with disabilities are 3 times more likely to experience sexual violence. Children with intellectual disabilities are 4 times more likely to experience sexual violence. Disturbingly, it's estimated that up to 70% of young women and girls with disabilities will be sexually abused before they reach 18. But there are reasons behind these high numbers, and organisations must face up to them. Children with disabilities can be more dependent on adults for personal and intimate care, and this dependency can put them in situations where abuse can easily occur. Girls and boys with disabilities receive disproportionately low levels of sexual education, and as a result are poorly equipped to recognise, report and resist sexual abuse. There are also myths and wrongful assumptions that relate to disability that can put children with disabilities at further risk of sexual abuse, such as the idea that children with disabilities experience less harm from sexual assault due to a lack of understanding, or more worryingly, that children with disabilities will not be able to remember or communicate the abuse which they experience, which means a perpetrator of sexual abuse may believe they are less likely to be caught. To combat these real and dangerous risks for children with disabilities, organisations must recognise and increase awareness on the intersectionality of age, gender and disabilities that put girls with disabilities at particular risk. Organisations must ask themselves the extent to which the voice of girls and women with disabilities are included in leadership or planning, and must seriously consider what staff or volunteers are spending excessive time alone with children with disabilities, including sign language interpreters, medical staff, or personal assistants. One thing the guidelines asks practitioners to do is to move away from simply assessing risks within the 3 areas of staff and personnel, programme and processes, and physical space, and suggests instead that we begin to think about risks in terms of barriers, for example, attitudinal barriers or environmental barriers. Considering barriers allows practitioners to expose the real risks children with disabilities experience in our work. For example, if we consider environmental barriers and associated risks for children with disabilities, we begin to realise that we may have designed activities that take place where there are trip hazards or where there are uneven floors or steps which make it difficult for children with disabilities to move around safely, or in places where there are no accessible toilets, or where accessible toilets are far away from activities and unsafe for children with disabilities to access. Throughout the guidelines, we place emphasis on consulting with, informing, and getting feedback from children with disabilities themselves throughout the safeguarding process. For example, in Chapter 8, which looks at ensuring reporting mechanisms are disability inclusive, the guidelines recommend consulting with children with disabilities themselves and asking them where they would prefer to report or how they would prefer to report, and then advises practitioners to ensure that these reporting routes are available in the places identified. Chapter 8 also stresses the importance of ensuring children with disabilities are informed of their rights, are informed of the behaviour that they can expect from practitioners, and crucially, that they are made aware of the reporting mechanisms that are available to them. The guidelines remind practitioners that this information must be communicated to children in accessible and appropriate formats. Fundamentally, if children with disabilities are not made aware of what constitutes as abuse, or what accessible reporting channels are available to them, the safeguarding cycle will break down for them. The abuse they experience will go undetected and they will be further left behind. One thing that is easy to forget is that a response to an incident is as important as prevention of that incident in the first place. And children with disabilities have a right to an appropriate response, just like everyone else. A failure to treat child safeguarding reports concerning children with disabilities with the same formality, diligence, and urgency as incidents involving children without disabilities, or a failure to involve children with disabilities in a response and listen to their preferences, is fundamentally a violation of their rights. Chapter 9 outlines 6 key principles for dealing with child safeguarding responses in a disability inclusive way, and talks about respect, communication, listening, objectivity, confidentiality, and managing expectations. Running through the chapter is the continual question, would the response be the same if the safeguarding incident in question involved a child without disabilities? If the answer is no, practitioners must be asked to reflect and justify why decisions would differ for a child with disabilities. This will help us uncover unconscious bias and assumptions that make children with disabilities less safe in our work. We have tried as much as possible to make these guidelines practical and easy to use. There are checklists at the end of each chapter which summarise key recommendations in that section and allows organisations to assess their child safeguarding practices as they relate to children with disabilities. There are also a number of tools that can be photocopied or pulled out of the guidelines. For example, a disability inclusive child safeguarding policy audit, which can be used as a checklist when reviewing safeguarding policies for disability inclusion, or a myth-busting sheet that can be conducted with staff, partners, consultants, and communities that organisations work with to facilitate a more open discussion around harmful myths and practices that can lead to child safeguarding risks for children with disabilities. We've also created shorter or condensed versions of the guidelines. The first one provides a brief overview of what organisations as institutions need to consider when safeguarding children with disabilities. And the second provides top-line advice to practitioners within the 4 stages of the safeguarding cycle. These shortened versions can be used to get a snapshot of the issues or can be printed and handed out in the field. On the other hand, the full version of the guidelines is intended to be used as a reference document that individuals can use as and when required. We do not expect individuals to read the whole document, but instead dip in and out and refer to different chapters when specific information is required. We have also provided an annex at the end of the document that highlights specific considerations for disability inclusive child safeguarding during a pandemic. This section looks at the use of personal protective equipment or the increased use of technology and how these new realities affect our approach to safeguarding children with disabilities. Although we have provided practitioners with a significant amount of information and advice across the guidelines and the pullouts, this is by no means the end. We encourage comment and critique, and we plan to review and revise the guidelines based on future testing and feedback we receive. We need to remember that there are organisations out there, such as a number of organisations of persons with disabilities, that are already doing brilliant work that safeguards and protects children with disabilities, even if it isn't recognised as such. We hope these guidelines will encourage organisations to begin to tap into that wealth of knowledge and listen and learn from these organisations to bring disability inclusive safeguarding into the heart of all of our organisations. But that's enough from me. We now have another short practitioner video, which I hope will inspire you to think a bit more about disability inclusive child safeguarding in your work. And then we will hear from Anne Wafula-Strike, a long-standing Able Child Africa patron, who is going to tell us why she thinks the guidelines are so important.
Children with disabilities are more likely to experience harm than other children. They are more likely to live in poverty, more likely to be institutionalized, and more likely to experience discrimination. They are 4 times more likely to suffer abuse and 3 times more likely to be victims of sexual violence. All children, including children with disabilities, have the right to be protected from this abuse. And as practitioners, the responsibility is on us. We need to take extra precaution to protect them. We need to make safeguarding a priority. We need to raise awareness of the specific and increased risk children with disabilities face by asking them about their own experiences and take action accordingly. Children with disabilities have the right to report the harm they experience. We need to create accessible reporting mechanisms that children with disabilities can use and ensure that all incidences concerning them are reported. And finally, we need to respond to every incident, communicating the response to the child in an accessible and sensitive way. We must and can do better to ensure our work protects all children.
From my experience as a child growing up with a disability in Kenya, I never felt safe, and there was no system to protect me. One time I remember one of the workers tried to touch me inappropriately, but I got away of that situation just because I was mouthy and I was able to raise this issue. But how many young girls are suffering? How many young girls are having such experiences without any support or without any help? And so I want to thank everyone at Able Child Africa, Save the Children, and the FCDO, who has made these guidelines a reality. They are really something special. This is something that has been needed for some time. For too long, there has not been enough protection in place for children with disabilities in our work. I am therefore delighted we have this significant resource in a much needed process to ensure children with disabilities can properly be safeguarded in these programs as we deliver. It is no longer okay not to afford children with disabilities at the same rights as everyone else. It is no longer okay not to make the next precautions to safeguard children with disabilities because it is too difficult or costs too much money. It is vital that organizations like yourselves do everything you can to ensure the children with disabilities you engage with are effectively safeguarded. It is vital that passionate advocates like yourselves hold your own organizations to account to ensure that all children are protected. So I encourage everyone to take these guidelines and adapt your own procedures to ensure they are inclusive. I encourage you all to share the learning as widely as possible to your managers and colleagues, to your partners in your own country and the countries where you all work. Only by sharing this knowledge and holding each other account, we will ensure children with disabilities are safeguarded. And now I want to thank you all for attending today. And I hope this is the start of a positive journey for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne, for those powerful words. Now we've taken another step forwards and we now have these long-awaited guidelines. I look forward to seeing how all the amazing work that we've seen today can be put into action. Able Child Africa and Save the Children have both published the Disability Inclusive Child Safeguarding Guidelines on their websites, and we'll be sending round the links after the event so you can all access them. Following on from this launch, Able Child Africa will be hosting more detailed events on how to implement these guidelines, so look out for the details on these. Able Child Africa will also be offering individuals and organisations training and workshops around disability inclusion and disability inclusive child safeguarding. To express an interest in these, you just need to get in touch with Lauren, whose contact details will follow shortly. And that brings us to a close. I want to thank absolutely everyone who participated in the development of the guidelines and this launch. And on behalf of everyone at Able Child Africa, thank you all for attending. Have a great afternoon.